Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with chapter 6, verse 21. We read this pasuk yesterday, and the pasuk was describing the fact that for a korban chatas, a sin offering, an earthenware vessel in which the meat from the sin offering was cooked needs to be broken afterwards. And just to explain with a little bit more detail, it's interesting because there's an absorption in the vessel of something sacred. So on the one hand, it certainly wouldn't be appropriate now to use for a Tuesday night supper. That's for sure, regular Tuesday night supper. And even for other sacred things, my guess is some of you were wondering about that. Even for other sacred things, it would be inappropriate to use it moving forward because there's a halach of nosar. Nosar is that whatever is left over from a sacrifice past the time in which you're allowed to eat it is now prohibited to partake of. So if there's an absorption of that meat of the chatas within this vessel, then of course it's fine during the period in which the meat of that offering can be eaten. But once it's past the time that that offering may no longer be eaten anymore, then that absorption is prohibited, and it would be the equivalent of having something non-kosher absorbed into your vessel. So of course you wouldn't be able to use it for other foods. Now, if the vessel is made of metal, there's a way to kasher it. But if the vessel is made of earthenware, there's no way to kasher it. There's no way to get the absorption out of it. And therefore, you would have to break it. On this comes the kli yakar. Kli yakar on pasuk chafal. Kli cheres asher tfusha bo yishaver. Piresh Rashi fuadin l'chol hakachim. Rashi says this is not a unique halacha for a chatas offering. This would be true for the leftover for vessels used in the context of any of the offerings. But now says the Kli Yakar, this really needs clarification. Why would the Torah specifically write this in the context of the sin offering, as opposed to other offerings? The Torah is teaching us here that when something is absorbed into earthenware and pottery, it can't be kashered, it doesn't leave the walls of the vessel. The Salkadai Tachamina Dafka Bekadshim Kalim Hanechal Mishneyam Velaila Achas Shamachom Saki Bekderis Man Rav Alkena Bolea Kokach Harbayat She'eniyotsu Bididaf Yol Olam Bekadshi Kadshim. I would have thought it'd be different. So the Kli Yakar says, you could have a very technical answer why the Torah imparts this concept by the sin offering, because the amount of time in which the Kohen may partake of the sin offering is less than many of the other offerings. So therefore, I might have said, it's just a day and a night. How much absorption can it really be? Famous last words before someone called and asked the Shaila, how absorbed could it really be in that bowl? So the Torah is teaching us that even for this offering, that the amount of time the meat would be in there is pretty limited. Even so, we still say it's absorbed. Okay, very technical answer. The outside haremes karov l'shmoa. I skipped a line or two. You could say that there's another message in entirety going on here. Shatara sakelim. The purification of the vessel is in some way a metaphor for the purification of the person who committed the sin in the first place. Remember, this sin offering is being brought because someone sinned. There are some vessels that absorb so much of the prohibited item, and you can't kasher it afterwards. You can't purge it afterwards. You're just going to have to break it. And on the other hand, some vessels don't absorb a lot of the prohibited item. And you can purge it. You can wash it out. There are certain people who absorb a lot from the experience of having done a sin. And they have a very difficult time separating themselves from the bad habit that they've developed. And there's no way out unless the person breaks their own heart, meaning to really humble themselves before God. The heart that built up these desires of the person, that is the vessel, so to say, in which the prohibited thing was cooked, that the person thought about it, the person got excited about it, the person got animated about it. So sometimes the only solution is to break the vessel. So that, of course, is a very technical halachic statement, but it fits this metaphor as well. There are also people she'eno bolea harbe, that they don't absorb a lot from the experience. V'yesh lo takana b'choltahu, and they're actually they can actually fix themselves without a tremendous amount of effort. K'derech shamu razal, ma'itakante shel masaper lashon hara talmud chacham u'yasak b'torah sh'nemar marpei lashon eitz chayim v'imam ha'oretz u'yashpil atzmo sh'nemar v'selav b'shever beruach. So he says, the Gemara, when it talks about a person who says lashon hara, how could they change themselves? Well, if they're a Torah scholar and a pious person, then just study some Torah, and that'll kind of get it out of their system. And if they're a person who's not so pious, then they really need to humble themselves. So that's a fascinating idea, that you have some people that need to work very, very hard to get a sin out of their system, and some people, they can kind of wash themselves off. Interestingly, what we're saying right now is the factor is not as much the sin as much as the person who committed the sin, and sort of how moved they were by it, how connected they were to it. Skipping ahead a few lines, and that's why the Torah discusses the treatment of these vessels, specifically in the context of the sin offering. Lomar lach, to teach you, shebizman she'en zevach u'mincha, as taras achote ketaras hakelim. If there's a time when we can't bring sacrifices, bringing a sin offering is the atonement, is hopefully the spiritual purging. When we can't bring sacrifices, so then we need to purify ourselves like we would purify vessels. Person who's not so pious, who's not so spiritually connected, they're like the earthenware vessel. And the only way to move forward is really to kind of break themselves before they move forward. And if a person is very pious and etc., then they have to work on themselves, but they can purge themselves. Okay, I think it's an interesting idea to think about. Okay, moving on now to chapter 7, verse 11. Going on to verse 11. Shlomim is a very different offering. Shlomim is, generally speaking, a voluntary offering. And unlike the Ola and the Chatas, the Ola, we said, was completely burnt before God. The Chatas, part of it was burnt on the altar, and part of it was eaten by the Kohen. The Shlomim, part of it is eaten by the owner who brings the offering in the first place. Part of it is eaten by the Kohen, and part of it is burnt before God. Verse 11, V'zos Torah Zevach HaShlomim, and this is the law of the Shlomim offering, Asher Yakriv LaHashem, that a person brings to God. Now that phrase at the end of the pasuk, that a person brings to God, is of course correct and true. But it's the case for any sacrifice, and this is actually a rare phrase in this parsha. So the Kli Yakar is very interested in why does it use that phrase? Of course, the person's bringing the sacrifice to God. Why else did the person come to the temple? So Kli Yakar on pasuk Yud Aleph, V'zos Torah Zevach HaShlomim Asher Yakriv LaHashem, Lo Nemar Asher Yakriv LaHashem B'chol HaKarbanos Ki Meitzel HaShlomim. It only says that a person brings to God by the Shlomim, Asher Bli Avon Yerutzon, Kfi Shem Krovim El Hashem Yosem Mikol HaKarbanos Haboim Ala Chet. All the other sacrifices, generally speaking, are for sins. So, okay, so we actually had an idea yesterday from the Kli Yakar that if once a person does bring the sin offering, they have back to having a good relationship with God. But in the end of the day, the Shlomim isn't tainted in any way by a person's sinful activity. It's just they're just bringing an offering. So that person is considered very close to God from the outset of the bringing of the offering. So that's why it says that the person brings it close to God. His kibbutz Hashem. These psukim in the context of the Shlomim emphasize bringing it to God a tremendous amount, because that's the point. that the person who's voluntarily bringing this offering is cultivating a beautiful relationship with God. There's another thing besides the Tagad part. In the context of the Shlomim, it says his hands bring the korban forward. Well, how else does he bring the korban forward? And it doesn't say that by other offerings. Because anyone at whom God is angry and they want to bring an atonement, you know, the image of the sin offering is a person brings the offering to the Kohen, and the Kohen brings it forth to the altar, because the Kohen is sort of like the intermediary to God, because the person is only bringing this offering because they've sinned. But a person who brings a gift to the king as an honor, he can bring it by himself. Again, all the other offerings, the person either did or thought something wrong. The shlom is just the person wants to bring a gift to God. It's not appropriate to directly bring your offering to the altar if you sinned. It appears to be disrespectful. Therefore, you commission a Kohen to bring it for you. But the shlamim that are a gift before God, you bring it yourself. Some say that the phrase in the psukim, they should bring the korban to Hashem of their shlamim, is actually people should bless him and say, God should help you. You should be fortunate that all your future offerings should be just like this one. Lo chataos v'ashamos va'olos. Shouldn't have to be that you bring sin offerings. Avol etza ola nemar zos toras ola hi haola. Whereas by the ola, it says this is the law of the ola. That is the ola. Ratzalomar. He levada yavu. We hope that that's the only time the person ever has to bring an ola. An ola. He shouldn't have to bring an ola a second time because he sinned another time. But the idea is that shlamim is all about the peace, shalom, between oneself and between one's maker. I do want to say that even though this is very nicely said about the shlamim, it is worthwhile to note that the Torah gives the model of the sin offerings for a reason. And even without Beis Hamikdash, I think it's very worthwhile for us to reflect on that there's always a way out. There's always a path forward. And we believe in that. And it's a difficult thing if we've done something wrong, to sort of try to forge the correct path forward. And that's also part of serving God. So we discussed this morning the Kli Yakar's metaphor regarding why it talks about treatment of vessels, specifically in the context of the Chatas offering. And now we discussed the Kli Yakar regarding the unique wording in the Torah regarding the Shlamim offering.